BICOM based in Jerusalem. Thank you everyone for joining us, both some of our regular viewers and some newcomers. And I should also say I'm particularly welcome to join us some new friends from the Gulf. I am part of the Israel Gulf Policy Forum, and so we're very privileged to have some of our friends from there also joining us for this conversation. As usual, if people want to ask any questions, I've got my colleague Ronnie online as well in London. If you want to raise your hand, we can bring you in, or write a question in chat, and then we'll be able to ask your question. For those to our guests now who are probably familiar with Ambassador Dennis Ross, he has served as he's now the Counselor of the William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute, having in the past served as senior diplomatic postings for President Clinton, George W. Bush, and President Obama. He brings with him an enormous amount of experience from peacemaking from the 90s with the Israel-Jordan peace treaty, through to the interim agreements and the Hebron Accord, as well through general regional issues, serving most recently President Obama and the National Security Council, and also Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He's also the author of several books, most recently co-written with David Khashoggi, Be Strong and Good Courage, a profile into 4 of Israel's most important prime ministers. But today we're going to focus on the news of the day and President Biden and the potential policy as he enters the White House, as he begins his administration within the Middle East. He is entering into a region much changed from the one he left as vice president. We've got Iran openly violating the JCPOA nuclear agreement, causing destabilization or continued destabilization across the region. And we've also got the normalization agreements and the Abraham Accords. So if I can ask you just in opening, what do you make of what do you expect of the Biden administration in the Middle East? At that crucial moment, we may have lost him for a moment. Yes, if you can just bear with us, we've lost our guest. So please, hopefully he'll be back in a moment.
And I'm back, but you were frozen for me.
Oh yeah. Okay. It looks.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Do you hear?
Ronnie, can you bring him onto the screen?
Yeah, I can hear him. I see him.
Great. Over to you. Thank you, Ambassador.
Yeah. Okay. Look, let me start by saying that the Biden administration is inheriting a Middle East that has 3 wars in it: in Syria, obviously in Libya, and in Yemen. In each of these places, we can get into the discussion of it, but you have the Russians and the Turks on opposite sides, at least in terms of Syria and Libya. We see 3 different kinds of groupings in the region. We have an Iran grouping with the Shia militias. Every place where Iran has a kind of dominance where it uses the Shia militias, the reality is those are either failed or failing states. You have Turkey, Qatar, and the Muslim Brotherhood as a second grouping. So this is not just a Sunni Shia conflict. And as a third grouping, you have the Sunni Arab states, increasingly with Israel as part of the partner, as a partner to them. What's interesting is in this third grouping, you have a convergence of interests that grew out of common security concerns to begin with. But I would argue, and we can discuss this, that it's not any longer just a security factor that produces the convergence between them. The reality is in an area characterized by all sorts of economic consequences flowing out of COVID, there is a need increasingly for many states to see a value of partnership with Israel and a recognition that Israel is not going anywhere. I lay that out because the landscape that the administration is going to confront is one that does look very different, Richard, as you were saying, from the landscape that many of the people who will be in the Biden administration experienced when they were last in the Obama years of 2016. So I wanted just to say, let's be mindful of these three conflicts, be mindful of these three different groupings. And the third grouping gives rise to the normalization process that we've seen, even as the challenge of Iran is quite significant. And I want to pick up on that last point. Let's understand where the Biden administration is coming from. The Middle East is not a priority for the Biden administration. Its priorities are domestic. If I were to say the first, second, and third priority, I would say pandemic, pandemic, and pandemic. The focus will be very much, certainly for the first 6 months of the administration, on answering this pandemic. Before we came on, I was just saying we still are dealing with the legacy of what was the kind of mess that the Trump administration made of dealing with COVID. While Operation Warp Speed emphasized producing a vaccine, creating a distribution system was basically left to the states. And so there's 50 different approaches. There aren't nearly enough vaccines available. And so the whole preoccupation early on will be very much related to how the Biden administration is seen as dealing with COVID and getting through a stimulus package to deal with the economic consequences of it. Now, having said that, there is obviously an interest in restoring the American standing in the world, restoring the US as a good global citizen. So the early preoccupation in foreign policy is going to be writ large. How does the US restore its alliance system? How does it signal again that we will play a leading role on the world stage? How does it compete with China, which I think is the one area where there's unmistakably a bipartisan consensus? And you've even seen where something forces itself on the agenda, you see relatively early moves by the Biden administration. For example, the call yesterday with President Putin. That was driven almost entirely by the fact that New START was going to lapse on February 5th unless you could extend it for 5 years. So that required an engagement immediately with the Russians. And we've seen that. But even here, the idea of restoring the US having a certain commitment to values, not just interests, that everything's not just a transaction. You saw that in the phone call with Putin, where the president emphasized where we have a common interest, but also made it very clear. He raised the issue of Navalny. He raised the issue of the hacking of solar winds here. He's made it very clear that we will compete with the Russians. And that will also be, I think, the approach. We will compete with the Chinese, but that doesn't mean there aren't issues where we have common interests. And those issues like pandemics, we may face future pandemics. We're almost certain to face future pandemics. The pandemics, proliferation, terrorism, these are all issues that don't respect borders and where there is, not to mention climate change, and the climate change is a huge priority for this administration. So there will be areas where we compete, but we also cooperate. And that's going to be kind of the approach of the Biden administration. So I said the Middle East isn't one of the priorities, but let's look at what Iran is doing right now. So Iran is now enriching to 20%. Iran is now fabricating uranium metal. Iran has seized a South Korean ship. A day before yesterday, you had rockets fired by the Houthis, or possibly by, depends, there's some debate on this, by some Shia militias out of Iraq that hit Riyadh. To think that there wasn't an Iranian hand in this, I think is an illusion. Why is Iran doing this? To force themselves on the Biden agenda. The Iranians want sanctions relief. If you look at what they're saying, Supreme Leader made a speech on January 8th. And in the speech, he said, we're in no rush to see the Americans return to the JCPOA. That's not our issue. Our issue is sanctions relief. So what they're trying to do is to force themselves onto the Biden administration agenda by making themselves a problem that has to be addressed. And it will be interesting to see how the administration approaches it. The president has said during his campaign, and it's been repeated by Tony Blinken in his confirmation hearings, that we will go compliance for compliance. Now that sounds like a simple formula, but compliance for compliance means that the Iranians have to first get back into compliance before we will comply, meaning we would then lift the nuclear related sanctions. By most estimates, it will take the Iranians at least 4 months to get back into compliance. Where they're out of compliance, they have 12 times the amount of low enriched uranium that they're permitted to have under the terms of JCPOA. They have installed 2 cascades of advanced centrifuges in Fordo. Not only are they not supposed to be enriching in Fordo, but they're not supposed to install, even on an experimental basis, advanced centrifuges until the year 2025. Shipping out the excess amount of low enriched uranium they have, dismantling these cascades. It's not a case of turning them off, it's actually dismantling them. None of this can take place very quickly, and it will cost them some money. That's not the Iranian approach. You look at what the Supreme Leader is saying, even what Zarif is saying. It's up to the US to act first. The Iranians are claiming they need compensation, or they've earned compensation and deserve it, but they're also saying we must first get back into compliance. That's not the Biden administration approach. The Biden administration approach is basically, okay, we will be prepared to get back into compliance only after the Iranians are no longer violating the terms of JCPOA. Now, presumably there could be a step-by-step approach adopted where for every step the Iranians take to get back into compliance, the US takes some limited step. But if the administration wants bipartisan support for what it does on Iran, and it's clear that Biden's instinct is to get bipartisan support writ large, but certainly in foreign policy, it'll be very difficult to get that if we're moving back into the JCPOA. The JCPOA is a symbol, on the one hand, where there's been almost uniform Republican opposition. And if, for example, the administration wants to persuade the Republicans that compliance for compliance is a good formula, they will need to be able to persuade them that the US is going to be able to retain its leverage against the Iranians. If they can persuade them of that, and there are some ways to do it, and I'll get to that in a minute, then potentially compliance for compliance could work. But here again, compliance for compliance is a source of deep concern. Richard, you're sitting in Jerusalem. I don't need to say that it's a source of deep concern to the Israelis. We heard yesterday from the chief of staff of the Israeli military that he doesn't want to see JCPOA. He doesn't want to see a slight revision of it. That he chose to make these comments publicly at this point before there's been an engagement with the administration is a little unusual for the chief of staff of the Israeli military, but we can discuss that. But let's take the regional partners, not just Israel, but the Saudis, the Emiratis. They have a fear of the JCPOA that's different from the Israeli fear. The Israeli fear of the JCPOA is basically by the year 2030, there'll be no more limits on the Iranians, and they will have been allowed to build a very large and legitimately supported or accepted nuclear infrastructure. That means the breakout time at that point could be close to zero, even if we retain our monitoring. For the Gulf states in particular, the concern is much more what the Iranians do in the region. There are those going into the Biden administration whose view is that we have leverage because what Trump showed, even if we had disagreed with it at the time, what Trump showed is that the US can go it alone on sanctions, and the rest of the world, at least the private sector, the international banking system, they're going to follow suit, because if it's a choice between doing business with Iran or the US, and you lose your ability to do business in the US, it's pretty clear what your choice is. You stop doing business in Iran. That is true, but it kind of misses the point. Because let's say that the administration feels they can use that as a threat to get a follow-on to the JCPOA. Because if you look at what the president said when he was in the campaign, he identified 3 objectives. One objective was to prevent for certain Iran's acquisition of a nuclear weapon, to make sure it never happens. Objective number 1. Objective number 2 was to provide a credible path into diplomacy and negotiations for the Iranians based on the formula of compliance for compliance. Once you're back in the JCPOA, that's a starting point for negotiating a follow-on agreement. And the follow-on agreement is supposed to lengthen and strengthen the JCPOA. And the third is to use our leverage to counter the ballistic missile program and also destabilizing activities in the region and human rights abuses. So all that presupposes a kind of ongoing leverage. Let's say you're trying to negotiate the JCPOA, we'll call it 2.0, after you get back in the JCPOA. That leverage might work for producing a follow-on agreement, but it's going to take several years at best to be able to produce that. And the threat of that only is one you act on once it becomes clear you can't reach an agreement. Now, in the intervening period, which could be anywhere from 2 years to the full length of the Biden term, the Iranians will not be inactive in the region. So you have to have an ability to exert leverage on them as they're acting in the region. The Iranians have an approach which basically says, we'll do the JCPOA, but that doesn't have any relationship to what we do in the region. Now, of course, the Biden administration can adopt the same posture, which is, okay, whatever you do in the region, we're going to counter in the region. You know, if you want to say there's no relationship between the nuclear deal and everything else, that's fine, because we will do everything we can to counter you in the region. And here, there's a great deal that the Biden administration could do. For one thing, it can do a great deal within Iraq. We should be bolstering the Iraqi prime minister. We should be bolstering the Iraqi military to expand the political space they have. That shows we'll compete with the Iranians and raise the cost of them of what they're doing. We should, now that you have normalization increasingly taking place, we can actually do something we haven't been able to do up until now. It's been an American policy for the last, I can tell you, for the last several administrations to try to create an integrated missile defense network in the region, starting with the GCC. We weren't able to do it within the GCC because of differences within the GCC. We could do it bilaterally, but it wasn't an integrated missile defense system. Now, actually, you can integrate the Israelis with it. And the Gulf states actually will probably find that quite interesting because Israel has a very sophisticated network of its own to deal with outside, the Arrow missile for outside the atmosphere, David Sling for intermediate range, and obviously Iron Dome for short range. All of it's run by command control system and radar. This is what you're talking about integrating. So we can do much more of that to show the Iranians we can counter what they're doing with ballistic missiles. We can do much more to promote defenses against cruise missiles and drones, something that the Saudis found themselves quite vulnerable to. We can do much more to encourage discrete, but again, involving the Israelis, contingency planning to develop options to counter the Shia militias. Again, all this is designed to raise the price to the Iranians of what they do in the region, to show we will compete and it will cost them more. Normalization, promoting the normalization process is in fact another way to counter the Iranians. You build the network that is confronting them or dealing with them. Now, will the Biden administration do all these things? Again, one of the challenges is going to be, where does this fit in terms of the overall set of priorities? If you're going to deal with Iran, you need to be thinking about all these other issues, and also sorting out the relationship with Saudi Arabia will be very important. You want to bolster Kadima, you're going to need the Saudi help. You want to foster the normalization process, the Saudis will have to have some sense of, okay, if we take these steps, what do we get from you? I mean, think about what's been done. 3 of the 4 Arab states that normalized, it was as much their relationship with the US as it was what they were doing with Israel that drove the normalization process. In the case of the UAE, they created a relationship between normalization and no annexation, but they also said, you need to provide us the weapons that have been denied us because of the US commitment to preserving Israel's qualitative military edge. Now, they understood there's always been a distinction between those Arab states that were at peace with Israel and those that weren't when it came to our arms provisions. So they obviously were operating within a context. Now, what we've also seen is the peace with the UAE is a very warm peace. It looks very different from what we've seen with Jordan and with Egypt. The peace of Egypt and with Israel and Jordan and Israel are different for a lot of reasons. Wars were fought there, not a surprise. There was a history of that. There is no such history with the Emirates. The point is that they turned this into a warm peace, but they had their own interests in terms of the US relationship. In the case of Sudan, they got off the terrorism list. In the case of Morocco, we recognize their sovereignty in the Western Sahara. So every Arab state that normalizes with Israel will also have a certain interest in what kind of commitments it's going to get from the United States. All these things get bound together, and it means it's a very complicated approach to the region. You're juggling a lot of different balls, and an effective policy is going to have to integrate them. And I'll just stop at this point because otherwise I'll go on and no one will ever get a chance to ask a question. But bear in mind, to orchestrate all these different moves, you're going to need to have your whole team in place. We probably won't have an assistant secretary for the Near East Affairs Bureau in the State Department. In the best case, probably be at least March. Just the process of nomination and confirmation takes that long. So it'll take a little bit of time for the administration to get all of its people in place who have responsibilities for this. But what we have now is the Iranians trying to shorten that time schedule and force themselves onto the agenda and force the administration to engage them and what they want, which is sanctions relief. My guess, and it's not just a guess at this point because Tony Blinken pretty much said it, there will be serious consultations with the Congress, with the Israelis, with the British, French, and the Germans, and I would say probably with the Saudis and the Emiratis as well, before there's any serious engagement with the Iranians. So I don't think the administration is going to rush into pursuing the Iranians, even though the Iranians are trying to make themselves an issue. And this will be an interesting thing to watch. Are the Iranians able to force themselves onto the agenda? And if so, how is the administration responding? And is it doing it in a way that gives it a chance to have more bipartisan support? Is it doing it in a way that it addresses some of the concerns that it will surely hear from the Israelis, the Saudis, and the Emiratis? And what is the administration communicating in terms of how it will retain its leverage vis-a-vis the Iranians if we do get back into the JCPOA, even if that's not something that can be achieved right away? Now, I've written some things that offer a kind of alternative to that approach, but we can get into that in the Q&A if you're interested.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you very much for that. I'm going to take my privilege as chair and just open up some of the questions. And if we can just keep focusing on the Iran issue for a moment. You described kind of the compliance for compliance in the issue of sequencing. I mean, how realistic is that? And then if you can expand, we did share your article that you wrote in the Washington Post last week, but for those that haven't read it, maybe you could outline your alternative plans as well.
Okay, so look, I think compliance for compliance, as I said, produces an immediate stalemate because of the difference in terms of who goes first. But the truth is that's not that hard to resolve because, as I said, you could easily fall back to step by step. If it's going to take them 4 months, so they take a step to begin to dismantle the advanced centrifuges and they begin the process of either diluting or blending or shipping out their excess low EU. And so in return, the US can take a number of steps to start with. It could be humanitarian, start with, which will draw less of a reaction from the Republicans. I mean, the US can start in a way that has less controversy associated with it. I offered an alternative. Now, the alternative really has two different parts to it. Rather than trying to get back into JCPOA per se, go for what I call a less for less deal. Meaning, one problem that the Iranians are creating with the 20%, I didn't mention, Israel's longstanding position on 20%. Go back to September 2012, Prime Minister Netanyahu in the UN General Assembly said 1 bomb's worth of 20% accumulation on the Iranian part is a red line for us, implying Israel will use force. So, that is both a spur to action, but it's also a reminder that there is a shrinking breakout time right now. So let's say a less for less deal would involve the following. The Iranians go from the 2,600 kilograms of low enriched uranium they now have, which is actually more than the last report of the IAEA was 2,400. I know now from different different sources that they're at about 2,600 now. Let's say they go from 2,600 to 800 to 1,000. Now that immediately stretches your breakout time. Let's say they dismantle the 2 advanced centrifuges and they stop the 20% enrichment, and also they stop uranium, the fabrication of uranium metal. In return for that, we have different things we could do. They have $100 billion in frozen overseas accounts right now. I'm not saying give them $100 billion. I'm saying open up a few of those accounts. Or alternatively, you could, what triggered in 2019, the Iranian, what I call their maximum pressure campaign on our friends and on us, was when the administration 1 year after withdrew from the deal, for that 1 year period, they granted waivers to 8 countries to buy Iranian oil. You could allow, again, some waivers to those countries. The virtue of what I'm describing is, I think, severalfold. One, it reduces the immediate pressure that something has to be done because they're shrinking their breakout time. 2, it allows us to provide limited sanctions relief, but keep the sanctions regime in place. That immediately allows you to tell the Republicans, we're preserving our leverage. And they're not stuck with a symbol they don't like, which is the JCPOA. Now the Iranians may not like this. By the way, they've already, they're laying out 7 conditions already. And there's no partial, there has to be the sanctions all have to be relieved, not partially. What that tells you is they really are anxious for sanctions relief. And that's a lever you shouldn't give up. But so the point I'm making is less for less, avoid some of the political problems. It allows the administration to demonstrate it's retaining its leverage. It does provide some sanctions relief to the Iranians, and given their needs, if the choice is some sanctions relief or no sanctions relief, there's a good chance, it seems to me, that they will go for that, even if they're going to come in and argue against it. And you can anticipate their argument. It's going to come from Zarif. There'll be elections in June. If you don't do this deal with us, it's going to be much harder to deal with the people after us. The answer to that is you determine your politics. We don't. And by the way, you need sanctions relief, and that's not going to change whether you're there or others are there. But okay, you can anticipate that. The value of less for less, in addition to what I've said so far, less for less is something that you say, okay, we will now, we've done this deal. Let's now take the next 12 to 18 months to try to negotiate a follow-on. You retained your leverage for dealing with that. Now, I've suggested one other thing which wasn't in the Washington Post article, was in the longer paper I did for the Washington Institute. There is an acute danger, I believe, that of a war between Israel, Hezbollah, and Iran. And that's because of the precision-guided project, which the Iranians have not backed off of. Israel has been hitting, by my count, more than 1,200 targets in Syria. Been doing it on a very regular basis, going after not solely, but largely the efforts to promote the precision-guided project, meaning putting terminal guidance on the rockets that it's provided to Hezbollah and that it's sending into Syria. Israel can't live with tens of thousands of rockets that have terminal guidance on it. Small country, limited number of high-value targets economically and militarily, can't live with it. That's why it's carried all these attacks. But you'll notice the attacks have been in Syria. They have not been in Lebanon. And part of the precision-guided project is not just to provide the weapons or the subparts, it's also to create fabrication, local fabrication of the terminal guidance and putting it on the tips of these missiles. Now, Israel has not been carrying out attacks into Lebanon. It will expose publicly these places, but it doesn't carry out attacks. Now, there's a reason for that. There's a kind of mutual deterrence that exists. Nasrallah's made it clear, you hit us in Lebanon, we hit you back in Israel. And it's true, Nasrallah doesn't want a war right now. He knows if there's a war, Israel will come in because the only way they can really stop the rockets coming into Israel is by coming in on the ground. They'll come from the air, but they're coming on the ground as well. And they'll go after the weapons depots, they'll go after Hezbollah's weapons, they'll go after their fighters, they'll go after leadership. And Hezbollah could be decapitated, Hezbollah could be weakened to the point where, given other forces within, within Lebanon, Hezbollah doesn't know what its future is. So Nasrallah doesn't want a war, but Israel doesn't want a war because Israel is going to be hit with 2,000 rockets a day. That could go on for at least a month. Most of Israel will be living in bomb shelters. Not to mention, you send your forces in on the ground in urban fighting, the cost will be very high. So there's a kind of mutual terms. Neither side wants that war, but it could still erupt. And by the way, the reason Iran doesn't want it is not simply because Hezbollah could be weakened. Israel will not take 2,000 rockets a day over an extended period of time, in no small part provoked by the Iranians, and allow the Iranians to stand immune or untouched. Israel will hit high-value targets in Iran as part of this. A war that starts between Israel and Hezbollah will not only escalate vertically, but horizontally. So since none of them want that war, you could take a limited arms control approach. And you could bring the Russians and Chinese into this because the Russians don't want to be in the middle of that war. A limited arms control approach would basically create limits and would rule out weapon systems and the fabrication of rockets and missiles into Syria and into Lebanon. Now, it would leave Iran in place in Syria. But and I know there's a notion among some that you can get the Russians and the Syrians to force the Iranians out. I see no prospect of that. The Iranians have invested more than $20 billion in Assad. This is their lifeline to Hezbollah, which is the one place they've succeeded in truly exporting the revolution. And I don't see them being forced out of there. I can see them being limited because then the Russians can say, okay, they'll let the Israelis give them a green light to hit any targets of the Iranians they want. So the point is, a less for less deal as it relates to the nuclear issue in the near term could have a parallel approach on a limited arms control. Again, all this is designed to create a baseline to try to affect things over time. But it could reduce the risk of war, which, as I said, the only common interest that the Israelis, the Hezbollah, and Iran have is they share a common interest in not wanting a war. That's the only thing they have in common. One of the things about arms control has never been about ending conflicts. It's been about reducing the risk that a conflict can erupt and escalate. And that's why I say this is something where you could actually, where the Russians and Chinese would actually have a stake in this, and they both have some leverage on the Iranians. So what I'm suggesting is an approach that don't just focus on the JCPOA, think about what might be an alternative to it, but also think about something early on you could do in the region.
Thank you for that. I mean, the huge question on that all is kind of, whereas in the Iranian interest to widen that agreement, where they said that they kind of refused to so far.
Right.
Just a couple of points on from that. I mean, you mentioned first of all earlier the comments by IDF Chief of Staff Khashoggi. I'd love to know your impression there. And the way you described before, it was appreciated, the threat of the precision guided missiles from Lebanon. How much of there is a consensus, would you say, in Washington of understanding and appreciating the nature of that threat?
So let me pick up on that one first. I think coming in, it was not sort of at the top of the agenda. I think it's fair to say now there's greater awareness of it. Look, if you're an administration whose preoccupation is elsewhere, who has huge demands on you, the last thing you want is a war in the Middle East, right, of this sort. The war I just described, were it to take place, it's easy to see how it starts. It's not so easy to see how it ends. And so if there's a way out of that, I think there'll be some interest in pursuing it. And again, this is a huge concern for Israel, obviously. And so this is also a good area to have discussions with the Israelis. But I think also, the more you're dealing with this precision guided threat, it also allows you to be talking to the Gulf states as well. You're the Saudis, you're being hit by rockets right now. This is dealing with this kind of a threat is something that maybe you can build beyond just the narrow focus that I was describing. But so in answer to your question, I think there is much more awareness of this now than there was before. And again, we'll see how it plays out. Part of the challenge, as I said, is the beginning of an administration. And I've been through this several times. I know what it's like at the beginning of an administration. I've described it as it's both exciting because suddenly you're there, but it's also extremely chaotic because you don't have your people in place yet. A very small number of people have to take on the responsibility of doing a huge amount of different, dealing with a huge amount of different demands. So it takes a little while just to sort things out, establish your routines. What's the relationship going to be in terms of decision-making between the National Security Council staff and the State Department? The State Department will have very few confirmable people. Secretary of State was only confirmed yesterday. Next will be the Deputy Secretary and all the undersecretaries. It'll be a while before you get to the undersecretaries and the assistant secretaries. So, you know, you have a lot of people in place, but you've got to establish routines. You've got to sort of structure how the decision-making process is going to work. It takes a while for this to sort itself out. Now, I was surprised by the Kohavi comments, not because I was surprised by the attitude, but by the public nature of it. This is before you've even had a conversation with the administration. I'm sure it was driven by a desire to send a signal, but this is a signal that's already understood. When you beat people over the head with it, it's not normally the way to make them more open to being responsive. So, you know, if I had been asked for my advice and I wasn't, I would have said, communicate that in private first. You know, if you don't get satisfaction after private discussions, okay, then you go public. But to go public first, it was kind of interesting. I was wondering who the audience was. I wasn't entirely sure the audience was an American audience. It looked to me as if the audience was a regional audience, an Iranian audience. It was almost as if what he was saying was designed to say, look, whatever the Americans do, we have our own path. We see you as a threat. We're capable of dealing with that threat. And okay, if because there's a concern that the Iranians right now are trying to create a kind of pressure on the incoming administration, and there isn't certainty at this point of how the administration is going to respond, this was a way to send signals. Again, my own view, you didn't have to do it right now. My advice would have been, do a very straight presentation. Do a very straight presentation. Here's what the Iranians are doing. Obviously, there's going to have to be an answer to it. And you don't need to take it, you know, sometimes you can stop right there and you don't need to take it to the next step.
Yes, I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, I agree. I think there were multiple audiences there. I think primarily, though, it was talking to the region and to the enemy as well, talking to the Iranians, highlighting just exactly what they knew when that they were exposed, and their intelligence service was also potentially had been infiltrated, allegedly. Very interesting comments, and possibly also sending a message to the Israeli political echelon that all this is going to require a lot of money as well, and if you want them to sing the tune, then you need to come through and sort out a budget. But that's a separate issue entirely. I'm going to read you a question that we've just been sent. How come the US released cash to the Iranian regime that's using the cash to fund the proxy wars and armed militias? How come the US trusts a regime that doesn't believe in governments that always deal with non-state militias?
First, that question relates to why did the Obama administration do that?
Why would, if the Biden administration would do it, why would they give the sanctions relief that the money goes to proxies?
I would say, look, what I was talking about was a limited amount of sanctions relief, and the amount that you'd be releasing wouldn't be that much to begin with. If you want an example, you can go back to the JCPOA. Recall the interim agreement was done a year before the JCPOA. And at that time, the Iranians froze what they were doing, stopped their 20% enrichment, and they got the equivalent of about $700 million a month. That's not a lot. And to think that, that's going to, that they're going to divert all that when they have profound domestic problems, I do think they clearly their first priority is rarely addressing the needs of their public, but still the reason they want sanctions relief is because you have huge inflation, you have profound economic problems domestically. They need some relief there. And what I'm suggesting here is, you don't give it for nothing. What the Trump administration succeeded in doing was squeezing the Iranians economically. What it didn't succeed in doing is changing any of their behavior. Now, here you're trying to change some of the behavior to reduce the risk of a war, and to reduce, in a sense, not so much the risk of war, but you're doing this because you want to stretch the breakout time they have. The truth is, if their breakout time continues to shrink, sooner or later it'll trigger some kind of military action. And so, if you want to at least create a possibility that diplomacy could work, you're going to have to retain your leverage, but you're not going to get them to, as the Trump administration demonstrated, economic pressure that isn't accompanied by anything else doesn't lead to a change in their behavior. By the way, the questioner is right in this sense. They can't provide as much money to Hezbollah as they did, but they still provide probably $400 million a year. And they're providing some money to Hamas, not a lot. So yes, they were squeezed more, and yes, they still did this. But the fact is, they need some sanctions relief for what they can do domestically. And if there is, if you want them to scale back where they are and stretch out the time for breakout, then that's why I'm suggesting something like a less for less deal. But I have no illusions about the Iranians. And I don't think the incoming administration, well, not incoming, the Biden administration now, I don't think the Biden administration, certainly the people at top, I don't think they have illusions about the Iranians. One of the interesting things is I think everybody's objective is the same. Prevent them from having a nuclear weapon, curtail their ballistic missile program, and stop their destabilizing behavior in the region. The differences are, what are the tactics you need to use to get them to do that? There are some who will say, none of it will work, you have to have a regime change. Okay, that's a view, and there are some who hold to that view. The problem with that is nobody knows when a regime change will come, nobody knows what will replace it, nobody knows how much real damage and destruction can be done in the process before the regime falls, assuming it does. No one can ever predict when regimes are going to fall. And I have to say that the American track record in terms of regime change is an abysmal one. So trying to build a policy based on regime change seems to me to be a prescription for real failure. If that's not going to be the approach, the key is, how do you change the behavior of this regime? We know they're not going to change who they are, but we've also seen historically they adjust their behavior when the mix of pressure and giving them an out is balanced in the right way. Any policy towards Iran has to balance a variety of considerations and different pressures. And so the trick for this administration is going to be how to find that right balance.
Thank you for that. I've got another question here. Do you think President Biden will declare the Anti-Terrorism Act from the 1980s unconstitutional and allow opening of PA mission in DC?
I don't know the answer to that. And I would guess that even though the administration put out yesterday that it wants to reestablish the diplomatic relations with the Palestinians, it faces a couple of problems if it wants to reopen the office here. The office, by the way, was opened as a result of a waiver to the anti-terrorism law because the PLO was on the terrorism list, so a waiver was granted to be permitted to open it. That's not the only factor here. There was also a decision made that Palestinians could be held liable. Representatives of the PLO could be held liable in American courts. And there have been a number of judgments that were made. So there's an issue of do the Palestinians, they may want the office, but they may not want what goes with the office. Now there is a waiver that would permit us to deal with the the Palestinian representative at the UN. My guess is the administration will, A, look for a way to deal with the reopening of the office, but in the interim, it may just deal with what is permitted under the UN, under the arrangement with the waiver providing for dealing with the Palestinian representative at the UN. I think we will probably also see some effort made to restore for infrastructure projects that are, again, not managed by the PA. I think there's real unease with the level of corruption in the PA. So there is question. I think there's a desire to show a difference between the Trump administration, which the sole approach of the Trump administration to the Palestinians was kind of put pressure on it. Trump administration approach to dealing with most others that wanted to change its behavior was economic pressure. That was it. Iran with the Palestinians. And I think the Biden administration, it's not that it's not that it won't use economic pressure, but it wants to use all the different instruments, including diplomacy, where you also talk to them. I will say the Israeli-Palestinian issue will not be a priority for the administration for a simple reason. No one in this administration believes that there's any possibility of a breakthrough between the Israelis and Palestinians. There will be a commitment to two states as a goal, as a vision, as an aspiration. There will be support for the normalization process. And the critical question here will be, and it's been stated very clearly, is it active support or passive support? It will take active support to broker what might be some additional moves that can be made. My own view is if you want to break the stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians, you do it by taking advantage of Arab outreach to Israel. That's a vehicle where Arab outreach to Israel can produce some steps towards the Palestinians, some reciprocation by the Palestinians towards the Israelis. Or in some cases, the more functional the Israeli steps, the condition should be reform of the PA. That should be a position anyway. You know, the idea of two states is not one successful state and one failing state. So much needs to be done within the PA to reform it, establish a rule of law, and the corruption, build the institutions. That too can be folded into what could be this kind of a process. Pushing some big initiative, highly unlikely, because they understand that would fail.
Thank you. I've got another question here. Do you think the Biden administration will improve Saudi Arabia's human rights?
Well, I know it would like to. I'm not sure that's going to be such a simple proposition. I said it before, the relationship with Saudi Arabia is an important one, and the administration is going to have to sort out how it approaches it. On the one hand, I mean, think about the following. It has long been an American position and a desire to see Saudi Arabia develop the source of its legitimacy on the basis of modernization, not on the basis of Wahhabism. Now you actually have a leadership in Saudi Arabia that is making the source of who it is, its identity, modernization, not Wahhabism. So that's profoundly in our interest. But by the same token, obviously, there is a deep sense here, and it's not only among the Democrats. When someone like Lindsey Graham on the Republican side also says he's not going to deal with the MBS, the aftermath of the Khashoggi, what happened with Khashoggi has had a legacy here. You know, the combination of that with how the women activists were dealt with, it has produced a sense that some price has to be paid. The Trump administration made a big mistake by, in a sense, never imposing a price. By not doing that, it built the incentive and the need, especially in the Congress, to impose a price. And that still is there. Now, how you square that with what is the strategic interest that we have with the Saudis? And those, you know, think about it. What I said is, first, having the National Transformation Plan succeed in Saudi Arabia, which is carrying out a social revolution right now, profoundly in American interest and the interest of the region. Having the Saudis be prepared to take steps normalizing towards Israel, in Israel's interest, but in our interest too, because it promotes peace in the region, it promotes the forces of peace in the region, and it also strengthens the coalition against the Iranians, profoundly in our interest. Working closely with the Saudi on counterterrorism issues, profoundly in our interest. We may be focused heavily on climate change, but there still is going to be, oil is still a factor. The oil market is still something that we have an interest in. Again, involves the Saudis. So you have to take all of these interests on the one hand, and also recognize we have an interest in human rights being respected. Now, we're not going to be able to dictate to the Saudis what they do, but there needs to be an understanding. There needs to be a kind of rules of the road conversation, discreetly held. You don't do it in public. You don't beat anybody over the head in public. When you try to force someone else publicly to give in, you force them to dig in, not to give in. So there needs to be a kind of high-level, discrete discussion with the Saudis, laying out, okay, there'll be no surprises. Here are the stakes we have in you, but here are the areas where if we see you act a certain way, it's going to draw a public response, and you're not going to be surprised by that. There needs to be a set of understandings. The Saudis, I believe, will take some steps we want, but they'll also want to know, okay, if they do that, what reaction do they get from us? So that's the only way you produce an understanding along those lines is by having a conversation that produces it. How that affects actual Saudi behavior in the human rights area, maybe it tempers it in some respects. But look, I mean, they're going to determine what they do based on how they define what's in their interests. Having a relationship with the United States is in their interest. And trying to make sure that it's on a stable footing is also in their interest, but it's also in ours.
Thank you. Just on the Abraham Accords from last summer, how surprised were you when they were announced that kind of it broke the conventional thinking of standard diplomacy, that the Palestinians almost had a veto of any normalization between Israel and the Arab world? And with the kind of, as you've mentioned, the lack of priorities on the Palestinians, or the sides are not yet ripe, what do you think will be the Palestinian strategic approach now going forward?
Let's take both sides of that question. Was it a surprise for me? No. I mean, not my most recent book, but my last book was called Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israeli relationship from Truman to Obama. And one of the things I pointed out was that there was a misplaced sense that the Palestinian issue was at the heart of everything in the region. You know, look, as someone who's negotiated this for 30 years, I believe it's an important issue, but I always knew it wasn't the key to everything in the region. So I wasn't surprised at one level, and the fact is I was involved in discussions for some period of time on all of this, so I was not surprised by it. I think we do have to understand that the key driver of this was the UAE. I mean, and there's an irony here, because they created a kind of reverse linkage, because they said they came to the administration, not right away, but they came to the realization that they saw annexation as a threat, because they felt it would affect what they could do with Israel. They worried it would produce a backlash in the region. And so they wanted to stop it. Now, they came to the administration in early July and said, we'll fully normalize with Israel if there's no annexation. And they raised also the issue of the qualitative military edge. The administration at that point was also looking for a win. The UAE came and literally presented, here's a win-win-win. A win for you, because you get normalization. There's been no peace treaty since 1994. A win for Israel, because they get a peace treaty. A win for us, because it's both good in terms of what we want to be able to do with Israel. Bear in mind, in the case of the UAE, this was a process 12 years in the making. They began their relationship, truth is, back in the Bush administration. A little known fact, but I'll tell the audience. The beginning of the Obama administration, 1 month into it, I was in the State Department at the time with the responsibility for Iran. I got a call from Yusuf Al-Taibu, who says, can you come see me? And he has a suite. At the time, he had a suite at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in downtown Washington. come see me and want to talk about Iran. I said, okay, sure. I go, I open the door, and who's there with him? Sly Meridor, the Israeli ambassador to the United States. This is February 2009. The message was in the meeting, right? We're working together. We see common threads. In 2015, they allowed the Israelis to open a diplomatic office in the International Renewable Energy Agency in Abu Dhabi. Okay, technically it wasn't a diplomatic office to the UAE, but practically it was. As you know, before COVID, they were going to allow the Israelis to have their own pavilion in Expo 2020, with Israelis allowed to travel there on their own passports. This was pre-normalization. So this was a process of normalization. They chose to cross the threshold, and you're right, it was a big deal psychologically because it broke the glass ceiling. And it was huge in terms of the message it sent. The message it sent was Arab leaders are going to do what is in their national interest, and they're not going to allow the Palestinians to deny them the ability to do that. Now, still, they did it in a way that showed they weren't indifferent to the Palestinians because they prevented annexation of the territories allotted to Israel under the Trump plan. But the bigger, after that, to tell you how much things had changed, and since I'm in the process of telling stories, I'm going to tell another one. You'll recall that Bandar bin Sultan, the longtime Saudi ambassador to the United States, he did what amounted to a 3-night documentary on Al Arabiya, in which he went through the whole history, and this was with high production value, so this was planned with some forethought, of the Palestinian leaders never taking advantage of the opportunities that were available. And his explaining that we, the Saudis and others, always gave them cover because we're committed to the cause, but we did them no favors because they never acted on it. And we're no longer going to put ourselves in that position. The Israelis present a challenge to the Palestinians, but we have to pursue what's in our interest. Now, the story. Before we presented the Clinton parameters, which we did at the request of the Israelis and the Palestinians, and I was, the principal drafter of it, I presented them, I gave an outline, and we hadn't finalized it yet, but I gave an outline to Bandar privately. Why? Because I didn't want Arafat misrepresenting what we presented, and I knew he would. And I also wanted them to press Arafat to accept it. Now, his response at the time when I went through it was, if Arafat rejects this, it won't be a mistake, it'll be a crime. Now, he said that in private, he didn't say it in public. I would hear from others, much less dramatically, but other Arab leaders and other Arab officials, similar kinds of complaints. But they didn't say it in public, they said it in private. Why? Because the cause of Palestine was seen as a mobilizing cause that could be used against them. Now, the fact that you see Bandar doing this sends a signal. There isn't a fear that the Palestinians can mobilize against them. So what you have is a change. Now, when did it take place? It's more recent, but it's been coming. So my answer to your question is no, I was not surprised by it. I was pleased by it. I knew it was going to happen at some point. I was pleased by it. And there's an irony, even though it wasn't done this way, even though Prime Minister Netanyahu actually wanted to do the annexation because he saw it was going to be kind of a legacy for him. He was going to establish what Israel's borders were going to be with the Palestinian. The fact is, this became the kind of catalyst for doing something that was below the threshold, but you were moving towards it. And the region has changed. And again, I start off by talking about the 3 groupings. One of the most interesting things to me is what drove this relationship below the radar screen with Israel were the security issues. For sure, common security threats, for sure. But it's not just that now. Now it's being driven much more, or at least equally, by a recognition of need. Climate change and drought is a profound issue in the region. Israel reuses close to 90% of its wastewater. No other country in the world comes close. Italy is like number 2 at 17%. This expands the water availability, expands what you can do in agriculture. Food security, water security are big issues in the region. And what Israel can provide here is understood. So the point here is we're dealing with a region that is changing. And I wanted to do the three groupings also to show the contrast. Yeah, Iran has leverage because of how it uses Shia militias, but its leverage is in places where the states are either failing or are failed. And that's hardly an attractive model to others.
Ambassador, I think we've run out of time now, but thank you so much for your patience and for your fantastic analysis. It's really most appreciated. Thank you everyone else for joining us as well. We hope it was of use, and stay tuned for more webinars in the future from BICOM. Thank you all.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.